Hi guys, it's Caroline, and today I'm going to take you through the 13 books that I read in January. First up is Anxious People by Frederick Bachman, and I really had a good time with this. A Man Called Uwe is an all-time favorite from when I was younger, and I was really excited for this one. I don't know, the whole makeup of it wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but I think that was for the better. There's a lot more flashbacks than I was originally expecting, and it deals a lot with the idea of suicide and depression and mental health, which I was also not expecting. I probably should have with the title Anxious People. It was funny, it was really cute, and it has a really good message and an uplifting one. However, I do think some of the plot points were a little bit convenient, and everything kind of ties together nicely, but I guess that kind of goes along with a feel-good contemporary. But otherwise, I had a really good time reading it. It had some laughs, it made me cry, it hit all the emotional notes that you would expect from a book by him. Next up is Breasts and Eggs. I listened to this on audiobook and I gave it 3.5 stars. I think my first initial complaint was that it felt really disjointed between the first half and the second half, because the first half follows our main character who is being visited by her sister and her sister's daughter. Her sister's a single mom and works kind of as at sort of a nightclub type thing in Japan, and she's really currently obsessed with getting a boob job and sort of the emotional impact that has on being a teenage daughter, and also the sister relationship. And then the second half is more about the main character as she decides she wants to have a child but doesn't necessarily have a partner or really even want a partner. So it's sort of about her journey trying to get a sperm donor as a single woman. It's two disjointed halves. I think they're both really well written, but they just seem like two completely different books. And then when I finished it, I found out that this is translated fiction, and in its original language, these are two books that are companion novels that are put together. So there you go. I just thought it was a really good exploration of femininity and motherhood and sisterhood, but not in your usual way, and not just because it was non-Western, but also just the kind of dynamics that the book portrayed were a little bit different. Next up was Leave the World Behind. Now this is about a family who gets a rental Airbnb on Long Island for a family vacation, and then all of a sudden the world kind of goes into this weird mode. The TV stations stop playing, a lot of the lights are out, and this family, couple and 2 kids, all of a sudden hear a knock at the door, and it's a Black couple who's saying, this is the place we own, we were in the area, all the lights went out, and we came here to seek refuge. And so it's sort of the weird dynamic between this couple renting the vacation home and the couple who owns it. And it's just kind of a weird scenario. I think it's well written. I think it builds a lot of tension despite the fact that there's not a ton of plot. And I think that's a really great example of how hyper-realism can build tension, because one of the things the book does is it lists every single detail you can think of. They go shopping and it tells you every single thing they buy and why they buy it, which can get a little boring, but luckily it's a really short book. And I think the hyper-realism really plays to the strengths of the author and also just builds a lot of tension, like I said. Next, I listened to This Is How You Lose the Time War on audiobook, and I gave it 3.5 stars. I just think that audiobooking this book was a mistake, but I don't think I care enough to read it. Basically, it's about these 2 agents, Red and Blue, who work on different sides of this war that's happening throughout time, and they sort of change little moments to have this butterfly effect, and this is how these 2 different entities are fighting each other. But one day one of them decides to leave a note for the other, and thus begins a an eras long pen pal ship, and they start to fall in love. Basically, I thought it was a really interesting concept, but reading the book, partially because it's short, partially because it's overly lyrical, and partially because I don't think it's super well fleshed out, I don't think I understood any more about the relationship or the situation or the war than the synopsis gave me. It was just very hard to know exactly what was going on, and I think there was a lot of language that was beautiful, particularly about their relationship, but there just wasn't enough information about what was happening, and that caused me to really zone out during the audiobook. I think it's such a cool concept, and the writing was so good, but on a sentence level, as a whole structural piece, it really left me wanting a lot more. Then I read Starsight by Brandon Sanderson. This is the sequel to Skyward, which I read last year and really loved. It's a YA book about a girl named Spencer whose dad is shot down for being a coward at this like really important battle early on this planet's history, and she wants to be a pilot more than anything, and like there's all these things because they don't want her because she's the son of a coward. And this book just explodes the world of Skyward. Like, you take that world and you just learn so much more about it right at the final bit of that book, and this book just runs with that idea, and I really like it. It makes it almost like completely different. There's a lot of new interesting characters in this one that I really loved. I think my biggest complaint and why I gave it 4 instead of like 4.5 was because there were all these new characters who I really do love and care about. A lot of the characters from the last book that I love and care about got like pushed to the side. Okay, then I listened to A Promised Land, which is Obama's memoir, and I listened to all 29 hours of that on audiobook, and I thought that that was wonderful. I'm not a huge nonfiction reader, particularly like long like biographies and stuff, and I really thought this was so good. First of all, he's a great orator and he reads the audiobook himself, so it just sounds wonderful, and it just feels like you're a friend and he's like talking through his life. It only goes up through his like first administration, and I think he's writing a second book that'll be sort of like second administration onward. And I mean, he gets into the politics of it. He explains his rationale behind certain decisions, and of course he kind of, you know, rosies up some things that I think in hindsight we decide weren't like the best choice, but also you kind of see some behind the scenes looks on how difficult it was for him to pass bills through Congress because the Republicans were just like stonewalling him. And he kept it from being boring, which is saying a lot because it's a bunch of like political logistics and like for 29 hours. I feel like he's my friend now. Then I read The Knicks, which I would probably say is my favorite book that I read in January. I think this is wonderful. I gave it 4.5 stars. And this is about a kid whose mom kind of abandons him when he's a young child. And all of a sudden he's an adult, he's a professor of creative writing, and he sees on the news that his mom is basically being sent to prison because she like threw rocks at this like political figurehead who's ultra conservative. So it's about like politics, but also it has a lot of flashback to the 60s and like the Vietnam riots and just being like part of sort of the anti-war movement back then. Also like political action nowadays, and like a lot of stuff goes on. There's a lot of heart. I really would describe this as what I think Jonathan Franzen tries to be, but fails to, in my opinion. By that I mean sort of showing like middle America in the 50s to now, and I think this book does it so wonderfully. It just touches your heart. It makes you laugh. There's just a lot of interesting things going on with the actual prose. Like, for instance, really early on, the main character calls in one of his students for plagiarizing. She's supposed to have written a book on a Shakespeare play about all the logical fallacies in it. And while she's like crying and in his office complaining about how she shouldn't she shouldn't get in trouble for plagiarizing, he's like breaking it down like an essay, explaining all of her logical fallacies in her argument on why she shouldn't get an F. I don't know, it's just really well written, really enjoyable, and even though it was really long, it captured my attention for the entire time, and I highly recommend it. Next up, I listened to Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and hot take, I gave it 2 stars. I just don't think this book was for me. I'm not like a huge romance reader, but like I loved beach read. I'll read a romance. I have nothing against it, but I just found this to be super annoying. For one, it's billed as an enemies to lovers. Basically, they hate each other for no reason. And even while they're hating each other, they're like, I'm so mad. I hate you. You're the worst. And it's even worse because you're so sexy and I can't stop thinking about you and I want to lick your face. And you're like, it's like, there's no reason for them to hate each other, but there's also like no reason for them to be as obsessed with each other as they are. So they're like simultaneously stupidly hating on them while also like simultaneously insta-love. So it was like the worst of both worlds. And I found the main character, hot take, I found her to be so annoying. I found her to be really annoying, really stuck up, really self-centered. And I think we were supposed to empathize with her more. I also found sort of the third act where everything falls apart. I felt really like he didn't like do anything that bad, but we were supposed to be like, shame on you. Like, it was kind of her fault for the misunderstanding, and then he was upset about what he misunderstood, but then we were sort of like waiting for her to forgive him. I just found her to be very annoying, and that made it very hard to be invested in this romance. It was so painful. The final like 5 hours, I was like, I just want this to be over. But luckily, my next audiobook was absolutely delightful. It was The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. And this is about this like 40-year-old man. He works for an agency that goes and looks at orphanages for special magical like kids, and he makes sure they're being treated well, and he'll shut it down if they're not. And, you know, just keeps tabs on these orphanages. And he's sent away to this one very, very special orphanage with like ultra special children, and like is supposed to make the final decision, should they stay open or not, or is it too dangerous because these kids are just like so magical and so powerful. It is so cute. First of all, you will fall in love with these children. These children are to die for. Like, for instance, one of them is just this like giant blob named Chauncey, and all he wants is to be a bellhop. Like, that's his dream. Like, he just wants to run around. He's like, may I take your hat, sir? It is so cute. And you're just like, oh, and your heart hurts because he's this giant blob and no one's ever gonna let him be the bellhop. The like man who comes in to do the to see if the orphanage is okay, and the man who runs it, there's sort of this behind the scenes romance. And it's the perfect example of a romance that doesn't take over the story, but is like a really important part of it, but just like not just engulfing everything. It's so well integrated into the story that I was pulling for them. I love the slow burn, but I didn't feel like it took away from the actual like heart of the story, which was about these children and about like belonging and acceptance. And I just thought it was wonderful. Then, in honor of the movie release, which I will be watching and giving you my thoughts between this and the movie, so I won't go too in depth on this, is The White Tiger. I gave this 3 stars. I think my really brief thing is, this is very similar to both The Invisible Man and Midnight's Children, in the fact that this is a book written by sort of an outcast or someone who's done something, written, and like the writer is telling you they're writing to you, if that makes sense. If you've read The Invisible Man, you'll know what I'm talking about. However, I think this pales in comparison to both books, and particularly to Midnight's Children, which, you know, there's more parallels because these are both written by men from India, about India. And I just think that this was nowhere near as good. The writing's a lot more amateur. I think like the men in here were really weird and super horny in a way that I didn't love. And like the story was fine. And I did see like Own Voices reviewers complaining about this book because they felt like the writer was, he grew up in India, but I think he was fairly wealthy. And then he went on to get degrees from both Columbia University and Oxford. And I saw some Own Voices reviewers being like, yeah, while you are like criticizing India and this is really fair, like it's really hard to kind of stomach this from someone who like was always very wealthy and like is seeing it from a Western point of view. I don't know. I sort of took it as like if like some Wall Street bro started like writing a book about how terrible capitalism was, and you'd be like, yes, I agree, but also you're a Wall Street bro. Like, I don't know. It was fine. I'll be interested to watch the movie. The movie actually looks really, really good, and I wonder if I'll actually like that more than the book. Then I listened to what probably almost tied the Knicks for my favorite book of the month, and that is Hollowpox by Jessica Townsend. Now, this is the 3rd book in the Nevermore series, and I love this series. It's a middle grade series about a cursed child named Morgan Crow who gets whisked away before her 11th birthday to compete in these trials in Nevermore. She lives in this hotel that's sort of like magical and like sentient, and she has friends and she's a part of this society, and they just all have different knacks, aka like special abilities. The specific challenge is that there is a disease that is ravaging the Wunimals, which these are animals that have sort of like magical powers. They wear clothes, they go to school. It was so timely in the sense that it really it almost like merged the 2 ideas of 1, a pandemic and what it means to like be quarantined and keep other people safe, and 2, what it means to like be accepting and like how you treat people who are different from yourself. And I just think that there's a lot of lessons that a middle schooler reading this would like really learn. I think the messages are so strong and good without being preachy. I think the world is wonderful. I think everything about these books is absolutely great. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars, and I find this for all of them, is that the very like action scene at the very end, that where everything like important goes down, I always find myself slightly like, what's going on? And then I sort of get my bearings afterward when like she's explaining it to everyone else, like what exactly happened and what did she learn, and it sort of synthesizes it. Okay, 2 more. Next, another hot take. I gave Cemetery Boys 3 stars. I think it is a wonderful book. I'm so glad it exists. I think we need more books like this. It is about a Latinx trans teen. His families are these like brew hexes, and the idea is that the women have these healing powers and the men have this ability to be in contact with the spirits and help the spirits move on to the next life. And our main character, Yadriel, he just wants to prove to his family, like, he's a brujo, he can do this, and they won't give him the ceremony, so he performs it with his cousin. He gets the brujo magic, but in doing so, he raises, like, this bad boy from his high school who has recently died. And so there's sort of a mystery because his cousin has also just died, so he's trying to figure out, like, who killed the bad boy? Who killed his cousin? What's going on? He's trying to prove himself as a brujo. This book was kind of a mess in terms of plot. First of all, there was a lot of exposition. Like, we learn about the world because people just talk and talk and talk about it, not because we really see it happening. And whenever we do see it happen, it's explained very much before and very much after. Like, we don't just get to see it. And it's mentioned over and over and over again, some of the same information. And then on top of it, once the bad boy / love interest like shows up, we spend the 50 middle percent of the book just like doing random things that I felt had no like purpose to the mystery, just because it was a good setup and structure for the 2 characters to get to know each other better, to learn more about each other, and to fall in love. There's a lot of repetition of description. Like, if I had $1 for every time someone like flushed or their ears turned red, be a millionaire. And then the end was super predictable. I saw a Goodreads review that was like, you could have just named the person who ended up being the villain, and it would have been the same amount of obvious. And the ending took forever to happen, and it just kept going and going, and I was like, oh my God, like, someone do something. And also, like, when I don't like romances between an undead and an eternal and a regular, because there's only 2 ways for it to end. One, like, everyone's unhappy, or you have to pull some like weird magical trick, or you pull a Bella and make like her eternal. And I'm just never satisfied. And guess what? I wasn't satisfied with how this was ended. So, hot take. And then finally, I read Interior Chinatown, which just won the National Book Award last year. This is interestingly written all in like sort of like the format of a script. The author himself, I think, writes for TV. But basically it's sort of exploring the role of the Asian man in Hollywood, like generic Asian man, kung fu guy. And I think this had some merits, and it did discuss sort of what it means to be Asian in Hollywood. The first bit really focuses on this TV show, Black and White, that this guy is like an extra or like a special guest on. And it's about 2 cops. One's a black guy and one's a white woman. And sort of it's really about the relation, like the race relations between white, black, and then this Asian guy. And like, it really focuses on the white and black dynamic, and there's sort of like almost a weird take about how like black people have it better in film. I didn't know what to do with that, and that felt weird to me. But it was really focused on that, and like after a while I didn't care, and I didn't feel like it was saying anything interesting. Then it switches to like the main character falling in love and like experiencing fatherhood, which I found really emotionally like charged and interesting, but that didn't last super long. And then the end sort of just went off the rails in some wacky trial scene that felt like the author's last-ditch effort of like explaining himself. But I also didn't think it said anything particularly nuanced. I found that the screenplay aspect works to its favor in some points, but in others I just felt was really like unhelpful. I think it was confusing on purpose, whether it was like in real life or something that was part of like a showing or a screening of an episode. I think that was supposed to show how how a lot of Asian men feel like they're generic Asian man in real life. However, it just made it confusing, and I'm not even sure if I could like distinctly say, yes, that was the point the author was trying to make, because truly it could have just been the author not being particularly good at writing clearly, and I was more confused than I was like enlightened. Okay, so those are the 13 books that I read in January. So hope you enjoyed. Bye.